Conversations. I'm Rowena Chu with Khora Collective, and I'm really excited that you're here. Once a month, we're going to go live with incredible guests to unpack real leadership lessons, breakthroughs, challenges, and insights that shape how we lead. At Khora Collective, our vision is to create a kingdom culture of leadership that is generous and spacious for all Asian American Christian ministry and marketplace leaders across all generations. And our live webinars are a really unique way to invite voices you may not get to hear from all the time, but whose lived experiences and leadership lessons can help us think differently, grow intentionally, and lead with greater impact. And so we're so glad you're part of this space. Think of this as a conversation, not just between me and our guest, but also with you. All right, let's dive right in. I'm thrilled to host today's leader, Johanna Chen, a refugee advocacy research fellow with the World Evangelical Alliance. Welcome, Johanna.
Thanks, Rowena. It's good to be here.
Can I ask you to introduce a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Like you said, I'm currently a refugee advocacy research fellow with the World Evangelical Alliance. I'm passionate about creating change, especially mobilizing the global church to respond to the needs of the forcibly displaced and amplifying the voices of refugees in dialogue with the United Nations and governments. I'm also an educator with classroom experience, having taught high school history and government. And I hold a BA in history with secondary education certificate from Seattle Pacific University and a master's in international development and humanitarian emergencies from the London School of Economics. I've lived in 4 different countries and have an ethnic heritage from Hong Kong and Taiwan.
All right. And can I just say, even though we've just met, I'm supremely impressed by your background and your passion to be doing such important work here in the world. And of course, for our first question, I'm really curious to understand, how did you get into the work that you're doing now? Tell us a little bit about your journey. In particular, was there a moment which made you think that this had to be more than just something you studied and something you lived in the world instead?
It's a good question. Just for this role alone, I was in the middle of my studies at the London School of Economics last year when I got connected to the director of global advocacy at the World Evangelical Alliance. He reached out because he was looking for young academic researchers who would be interested in contributing to the work of the department. And I told him that I was really interested in refugee, gender, and education-related issues. And that's how my position at the WEA was created. In the work that I do, I work under the WEA's Geneva office to the UN on refugee advocacy-related issues, often related to persecuted Christians, but more broadly related to how we mobilize the global church to respond, particularly through church-sponsored refugee resettlement pathways. But going back quite a few years prior, my interest in forced displacement began when I first learned about the Rohingya genocide happening in Myanmar. I was living in Thailand at the time, and the Myanmar Rakhine government had just begun a mass attack on the Rohingya people, pushing many out into neighboring countries, including Thailand. I remember feeling really desperate, wanting to know how to respond, but not knowing what to do. And that moment really impacted the direction of my studies, impacting the classes I took in undergrad, influencing the choice to pursue a master's in humanitarian emergencies. But this work I'm doing right now, working in a Christian advocacy space at the UN, is something I never really thought I'd be in.
It sounds like the role was pretty much created for your profile specifically. Was there anybody doing that kind of work previous to you?
Yeah, before it came on, there was somebody who's working at the Geneva office in refugee advocacy as well. And he transitioned out right when I came on. And so the role has shifted slightly since I've come in, but overall, I think this is a relatively new role. The person before me had only been in the role for 2 to 3 years. Yeah.
One of the big challenges in international development is really taking research that's evidence-based and data-driven and then applying it in the field. And it sounds like your role bridges some of that gap between sort of academia or research and practice and operations in the field. So tell us a little bit more about how your role bridges that. And I see that you have passions in both. Talk a little bit more also about how you plan to use those dual passions going forward as you develop your career in international development?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think from the beginning, when I knew I was going back into my master's, I knew I wanted something to be able to bridge that gap between the academia and the real practice. I grew up in ministry spaces overseas, and so in different contexts had seen what it really does look like to respond in emergency crises response in different contexts. And I came into my studies with that background and then saw my academic learning as a way to kind of layer on my experiences and really understand structurally what's happening, phenomenon, and having language for it, and then going back in. And you're right, this work is a lot about bridging this gap, because we so often work with churches and frontline responders to, for example, refugee-related issues. Often it's the work of translating. So translating what they're doing to be able to translate that in academic and then United Nations language, and then vice versa, translating how UN policies impact our partners on the ground. And I think that it's difficult at times, but remembering who we're doing it for and remembering that at the end of the day, the hope is to partner with whoever's on the ground. And so however we can make the academic and policy language as the most accessible, that's kind of the key.
Yeah. It sounds like that you come from a background where you had to bridge a lot of cultures in the way that you grew up as a kid in the mission field. And then you're really leveraging that as a strength in terms of your early career. Can you talk more about how you use your background as a kid from the mission field to sort of inform how you react to different cultures and different situations now as a young professional?
Yeah, and I think this is something I really love. I love being in cross-cultural spaces, and I love knowing that every culture and context carries a unique facet about the world and have really something unique to bring. And so I think I come into those spaces with a really strength-based understanding of cultures, understanding that even though I don't understand every part of that culture or language or people group, there's something to build off, something to learn in those contexts. I think it's interesting as being Asian American and walking into those spaces and being young in my career as well. My background in those pieces they come a little bit as a superpower, but something that often people don't see initially. I've been in meetings where it's very easy for people to not see me or not understand that if I'm convening meetings, particularly around refugee-related issues, which I often am, it's easy for people to maybe miss me. But in the flip side, I think I really enjoy being able to scan the room and be able to see who's coming in with what power or what expertise or positioning, and how can we sort of work to create a more equal environment where people can enter in, and what do we have to do in order to shift power dynamics. And I think as someone who's coming from a Western context as well, I actually get to do that, be able to shift power dynamics even a little bit more. So I think I often look to who's going to be overlooked and who might be misunderstood in those contexts, and how can we listen to them and kind of make sure their voices are heard in those spaces.
Yeah, you talked about your leadership superpower. So I want to pivot slightly and look at leadership challenges. I think you alluded to one of those in the most recent answer, talking about how you're a young person, so your superpower, in fact, is often overlooked. Are there other leadership challenges that you're experiencing in your current role that you would share with the Khora community?
I think right now it's discerning which projects are mine to do and which mine to take on. The work that we do as a department is incredibly under-resourced and high need, and changes daily. And so I think it takes quite a bit of discernment to ask the Lord whether or not I should step into another project. And then I think I care a lot about sustainability and what does it look like to be able to thrive in this work for longer term. And this work has really taught me what it looks like to practice slowing down when in a crisis, all I want to do is speed up. And practicing really relying on team and drawing on expertise of mentors in the field and other people in my department to be able to think strategically, because they often bring expertise in things that I can't even see on from my end. So I think the challenge is learning not to silo myself off, but really how to lean on team and be able to also lean on the Lord, discerning which ones are mine to take on and which ones, though it might seem urgent, which projects might be okay to kind of attend to the next day or in a few weeks.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because we frame this as a challenge, but I also think of this as a superpower, because this is often something that leaders who are much further advanced in their career than you haven't learned. So I think it's a universal thing that all of us leaders, really need to discern. So it's an interesting discussion, I'm sure, that one that we'll keep returning to. Let me ask you another question that might be poised between that space between what could be a superpower and what could be a challenge. You mentioned a couple of times about scanning the room and also different power dynamics that you see when you walk into a room. So tell me more about that, specifically in the context of yourself as an Asian American leader. How do people react to you when you walk in the room, and how do you scan a room to read power quickly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when I enter a room, I often pay attention to who's standing and who's sitting and whose voices carry the most weight. Sometimes it's the person in the front with the microphone, and other times it's the group by the doorway, people who've arrived late. Sometimes it's in a meeting with senior stakeholders. I think I try to find who might be the meeting organizers and then who might be overlooked. Every stakeholder gathering has an unspoken hierarchy from the most important to the least important. And it can be really easy to rank importance based on dress or look or status or title, especially if someone is coming from the UN or a government representative. But relying too much on these cues can cause you to miss others who may be equally or even more important. And I think especially noting just contextually and cross-culturally how different people from different cultures may enter the room. I think I'm sensitive to those cues and often will scan first to see kind of what might be missing in the dialogue. And a big emphasis on the work that we do is collaboration and multi-stakeholder dialogue. And so what does it look like to lower those barriers so that we really can, out of a 1 hour meeting, 2 hour meeting, 20-minute panel, how can we make sure that we really do pay attention to whose voices might be overlooked?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very astute point. And again, I think that you probably draw a lot of unspoken cues from your background as someone who grew up across cultures and someone who's a young professional now working across cultures. So it's such an interesting topic. Can you give me a specific example of a time when you might have missed a cue of someone who was actually more important than you thought, or maybe the reverse? You had overlooked somebody and they turned out to be quite critical to the project that you were putting in place. So can you give me an example of how that worked, and when you realized that maybe there was a cue that you missed, what you did to reverse that situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, there was these, I was in some meetings in Korea this fall, and I was in charge of organizing and convening a meeting for heads of evangelical alliances who were heading up or involved in refugee ministries. So our World Evangelical Alliance, we work on partnering with our national evangelical alliances, and a lot of our national evangelical alliances in this meeting are part of countries that host large amounts of refugees. And so part of our conversation or the meeting's purpose was really just to convene and to listen to stories and to communicate to them that they aren't alone. And in a meeting of a lot of different people having an opportunity to be able to go around the room and to just for mutual encouragement. I think my biggest thing was emphasizing that there's very little that I can do specifically for them in terms of fundraising or partnering or even pushing a certain policy at the UN level, as I'm only one person, but was really focused on how can we create this space. But I think in emphasizing, there can be a risk in overemphasizing the need to create full equality at a table, that there can kind of miss the hierarchy that actually should be present in some contexts. And so, for example, was a lot of people in this meeting that I convened were from African contexts. And in our national evangelical alliances, those who are presidents or heads or directors of evangelical alliances are often archbishops or pastors, people with extensive ministry experience, sometimes 30, 40, or even 50 years of experience, where titles really do matter. And respecting and honoring their titles and where they're coming in from is something that's really important to be able to even create spaces for people to feel seen. If that was my goal, was for people to feel seen and heard in that meeting space. And I had sent out the invites and I convened this meeting, and I gave an opportunity for people to go around the table and, introduce themselves briefly, and then we kind of went into the purpose of the meeting. But I think at the end of it, I was reflecting and realizing, wow, there was so much more time I maybe even could spend in giving people a chance to introduce themselves, and understanding that title in these contexts actually play a very significant role in how somebody might feel seen or heard or valued as someone that is an expertise in their context that I don't have. So I think going back, if I were to redo that experience or that meeting one more time over, I think it would be to really take stock of what titles and leadership experiences are in the room, and even going more in depth into that strength-based kind of convening of a meeting where everyone is able to bring in a strength and really highlighting the fact that they are experts in their field. And so even more so taking a posture of humility from my side, but even setting that example for everyone else in the room too, so that people can truly feel seen and heard. And I think just another bit on time, I think in the Western context, we can think that, 50 minutes, a 45-minute meeting will be enough. And I think we could have sat there for hours. And I think, again, in those contexts, especially working with Asian or African contexts, I think time is really important, and being able to allow for that generosity of time. Because, again, these are complex issues. And there's a lot of heartache in the room, I think, as ministry leaders carry the weight and the loneliness of how hard this work is. And so if I were to do it over again, I think it would be probably to allow for that time and for that trust to build, so that people are able to not only come in, speak for 5 minutes, and then, listen for the rest, but also really build trust in that circle itself, so that it can feel like a mutual encouragement as well. Yeah.
I'm really glad you shared that anecdote. I think it is a cultural stereotype, but it's often said that in the West we prioritize efficiency and productivity. So therefore our time is really valuable, and kind of getting to a goal, driving to the goal, and driving to that goal as directly as possible becomes very important. Whereas in African, Asian contexts, the trust and the relationship takes priority. And so, things can often take far longer and seem indirect, but it is because a different value is being prioritized right there in the room. Yeah, I think I enjoyed your story about the meeting that you convene. And so I sort of want to build a little bit on that from Are you able to take these kind of lessons where you're convening, it sounds like very complex meetings with many diverse voices around the table, and to bring that back into your own working teams, where instead of convening one meeting, you're sort of building a longer term relationship? So talk a little bit about team dynamics in your current role. And then I wanted to ask you some sort of follow-on questions about what sort of lessons you felt you learnt when you joined the team that you're currently on, and what sorts of lessons will you take away from the current team you're on if you were to transition out one day?
Yeah, those are good questions. I think it's a little bit, my team primarily is from a Western context. So Canadian, American, and then European. And so I think that is a little bit, and all of our meetings are almost entirely online. And so I think that's another aspect. The meeting I hosted in Korea was in person, and our team meetings are online. And in some ways, it gives an opportunity for, if you're doing on Zoom or other ways, people can see across the grid, who's in the room. And in other ways, I think sometimes it is harder to allow for that generosity of space and time, because either you're on a time crunch, people are busy, we're working often in time zones. And so oftentimes the meetings I hop on are really, really late at night or really, really early in the morning for me. But I think in the few times I've gone in person with my team, those have been really, really valuable in just relationship building and trust building, getting to know them as people outside of the work that they do. Gives me a greater understanding for the strengths that they're able to bring into their roles. And then I think, my work is unique in the fact that I work with a lot of different teams as well. And so I think we've talked before about how my role is really bridging. I work with 2 different organizations as well. And so, and then within many other different regional teams. And so I'm consistently working with different teams based on different projects that I'm doing. And so sometimes it requires a little bit of a reset whenever I enter into the room or the Zoom space or online or over email. It's okay, how are they coming in? How am I coming in? How can we best maximize this partnership and collaboration? And if it's possible, allow for that time in a project or over a meeting space to be able to build a greater understanding of who people are in the room more than just what they do. Because then I think that also contributes to greater partnership. Yeah.
If you were to advise a young person who is nervous about transitioning onto a team where they may not know everybody on that team, they may also be working in a cross-cultural context, what are like the top 1 or 2 things that you would advise a young person to keep in mind as they're transitioning to a new environment?
I think something that has served me well in these contexts is having just my eyes open and ears open as I enter into the space. That I am looking for cues. I'm trying to understand dynamics, because more often than not, especially if you happen to work in a Christian organization or a nonprofit setting, things might not be as clear in handbooks or onboarding materials. That there might be that, and then there's another whole set of cues and dynamics that you don't get right away, especially in a 2-week or 1-day onboarding session or a few months even. So I think listening and looking, and then not being afraid to ask questions. I think I think being Asian, I'm very deferential. And so oftentimes if I get asked to do something, I will just kind of say yes and do it right away. And I think working in with mainly colleagues from Western contexts, I'm understanding that, sometimes when I'm getting asked to do something, it's actually more of a suggestion than it is for me to do it. And there's opportunity for even dialogue. And I don't think I'm still growing in that piece of confidence to be able to ask questions or to push back a little bit. And that in Western context, specifically working in predominantly white spaces, that my colleagues might even appreciate that a little bit more feedback, a little bit more even challenging, because they understand that their idea is simply just a suggestion, and there's opportunity for that to change and adjust. And so I think if you're young, and especially if you're Asian American or coming from a more deferential culture where working with people older than you is really there's a lot of cues there and a lot of expectations in your own cultural background. I think it's also, I think there's a lot of strengths in being differential. And I think that there's still more to be learned, because I think I underestimate myself a lot on spaces. And so not being afraid, I think, to ask questions and to take up a little bit more space. Not in the way that, anyone else might, your colleague might, but in a way that feels unique or safe to you.
Yeah. I think you're very insightful about your own leadership style. Clearly, you've spent some time self-examining it, and obviously working with your own leadership style in many contexts sort of brings a mirror to your leadership style. You talked a bit about having a very distinct Asian American style of doing things. You mentioned the word deferential a couple of times. Have there been examples where you've been successful at communicating your leadership style, perhaps in a dynamic with a co-worker that is expecting you to push back a little? Have you had an open conversation about being more deferential, providing more feedback? And how has that conversation gone for you?
Yeah, I think that the things that I'm saying right now are things that I've reflected on in the last, maybe just 2 months. And I'm realizing, like, oh, these are the dynamics that are present. And so I'm not sure if I've had a full conversation before. I think I've definitely had one with my director before, just saying like, hey, I think this is what I do. And, he's very gracious, and he's like, okay, like, how can I support you in this? And I think I have yet, perhaps this is something I will do, in the coming months as well in my work. But what I realize is a lot of my own stress from the work comes from wondering if I'm doing it wrong, and then being afraid to ask if I am doing it wrong. And I think part of it is growing up in Asian context, where you kind of just like receive the instructions, you keep your head down and you do it. And then you hope for, a subtle approval from your boss, or your, or even the pressure to kind of like, in certain Asian contexts to like, especially like homogenous settings, to just kind of like look like everyone else. And so kind of looking around and wondering, like, am I doing it right? I think I am, trying to be busy.
Right.
And so I think that there's still more that I'm learning in that space of, okay, wait, I think, again, my own stress comes from wondering if I'm doing it wrong. And so maybe bringing that up, and then also understanding that I will always be my harshest critic, my own harshest critic. And that honestly, and especially in this work, I think that there, maybe this is working in a Christian organization or organization that's not afraid to take risks, that there's a lot of understanding that there's a lot to be learned in taking risks. And even if things don't work out entirely, there's still a lot of value in it. And so I think I really appreciate working in a space like that. Value innovation and creativity, and even if it might not be in the playbook, that there still might be an opportunity to try it out. And I think I'm always looking for the playbook. So
yeah. It's really interesting. You made some comments about homogenous culture. and sort of the unspoken cues in a homogenous culture. You said that if you're in a purely Asian culture, there would be a lot of looking around the room to see how everybody else was behaving and trying to fall in line with that.
Mhm.
And so I think when you're in a homogenous culture, be it an African culture, an Asian culture, or a European culture, there are sort of these unspoken cues. You said an unspoken playbook, perhaps that word is appropriate, about what is going on, that everybody gets, even though you aren't explicitly told it. But in a more international and global culture, like the one you're working in, it's often sort of prudent to be a bit more explicit about that, because you can't assume that people will understand the African way of doing things, or the Asian way of doing things, or even the Western way of doing things, even if that's a global a more dominant way of doing things. It still sort of needs some explaining. So can you offer an example of within your leadership where you've been able to explicitly communicate about something that was unspoken, and maybe it took you some time to realize that this was an unspoken sort of cultural norm for you that wasn't a cultural norm for somebody else? How did you communicate it? Did it come across well? If it didn't, tell us more about that. If it did, tell us more about that. So that those who are listening, might take this as a cue to kind of be more explicit about unspoken cultural norms that they experience in their own workplaces.
Yeah, let me think about that. I think that brings up a lot of thoughts. I think what you just touched on, I work in a very, very diverse context, and so much of my work so far has just been like watching and trying to learn, like just as
Yeah.
you said, what's happening here. Um, let me think. Um, hmm. I'll say this. I think what comes to mind is a close, is it close power distance? Just power distance itself. And
Right.
so far away power distance or closer power distance. And I think realizing that in certain Western cultures, a closer power distance is just expected. And so
Mm.
it's calling people by their first names, even if they're really older than me, or expecting this kind of um, in Western context, like we're colleagues, we're buddies. Whereas in Asian context, it would be we're high power distance. And so there's this, no, you're very clearly my boss. And I think this is what our professional relationship should look like. And so I think I'm not sure if this has actually come through in conversations I've had with like formal conversations, but I think in one space, I'll say this. When I came in as a research fellow, so postgraduate research fellow. How I was received by my teams was very much, you are one of us, and we expect you to, we're welcoming you in as if you were a full on kind of like mid-career professional. And there was so much where personally I was uncomfortable with that, because I was thinking, oh, I'm in a position to learn. I'm like the intern. I shouldn't be doing the extent of projects to which that I am doing, because this feels like the work that a mid-career professional would be doing versus someone brand new to this work. And so I think I was consistently maybe doubting myself or putting my in a position where like my colleagues would expect me to interact at this level. And I'm like, oh, but I think I'm still at this level. Like, and some of it came out in conversations where I just trial and error, but realizing, okay, there's a certain extent to which me doubting myself is really is really hindering my ability to be able to communicate well with my colleagues, because consistently saying or putting out like worrying just maybe individually, like, am I doing this right? Is I'm missing an opportunity, I think. One, to ask my colleagues if I am, and ask for more help if I don't understand the system. And then second is to really believe that there is an opportunity to try and to fail, and that my colleagues might even understand that and that they're okay with that. Thus in giving me greater freedom or greater trust to be able to do these things. Example is one of my friends, she is working as an intern at an embassy this year, and we were comparing notes just in December about how our internships or fellowships were going. And I was telling her about my work, and she goes, "How does your organization trust you this much to do all that you're doing?" I think we function very much as an all hands on deck sort of team.
Right.
And I think that's the context of kind of the an organization with maybe we have less people on our team, and so we just have to do more. But then I think some of it is that higher trust that and maybe lower power distance as well. And so this expectation, you can do it, even if we know you're new, but actually we have a lot of faith in you, and and so part of it has just been like learning, okay, how do I walk into that? What's appropriate for me to take on, and what's also appropriate for me to say, hey, I think I need more support in this.
Yeah.
And balancing both.
Right. I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that tension between a challenge and a superpower. And because you're in a low power hierarchy environment, you've been given the opportunity to hit a lot of stretch goals. You've been given things like a mid-career person might have been given. And that's both a challenge and a superpower. So then that leads to my next question. How do you recognize a challenge as a challenge and a superpower as a superpower? And how do you distinguish between them? So another way of perhaps putting the same question is, what about boundaries? It sounds like in an environment where you're given a lot of rope to run with, and you can operate as a mid-career person, but you're also at the same time somebody that's new in your career, and so you're learning lots of things. It sounds like boundaries are not so much imposed on you as you have to kind of go out and find them. So tell us more about how you find boundaries. How do you connect with boundaries, and how do you wisely implement them to kind of protect yourself, your peace, and your energy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really, really honest question. I'd say boundaries in secular spaces, and especially in secular. I think. Yuli, are you there?
Sorry, I cut out. I'm back.
Okay, perfect. Let me think. What was I going to say? Boundaries. Yes, I think in a ministry space, it's difficult to set them. Again, I think it wasn't until December that I began to name. Oh wait, there will always be need.
Yeah.
And I can't. I'm not superhuman, and so I cannot respond to every single need that comes across my plate every single day or hour of the day. And I think it was after realizing, I'm waking up, I'm checking my email in the middle of the night, I'm trying to respond to text messages from colleagues, and realize that I need to figure out a path forward that's actually sustainable for this work. And I think to that, one has been my growing understanding in theology of rest. And what does that look like to that Hebrews invitation, that God's rest is a commandment, and that when I rest, I kind of give everything back to the Lord and say, all this was yours initially anyways. And I believe that you will sustain and protect your children even when I'm sleeping, and that you'll give me wisdom for the projects I need to do in the time I need to do.
Yes.
And so that's something I'm growing in and trying to name and understand that I don't get a medal for pushing myself any harder or sacrificing myself for the sake of this work, as important as it is. And handing that glory off to the Lord and just saying, I need to figure out how I can, in my own human limitations, do this work with integrity and clarity and consistency.
Mm. Yeah.
So I think for me, what's begun is that at the beginning of each week, I write down 3 things. One thing is a project that I'm working on and actively, what's a goal I want to complete by the end of this week. Second thing is what is a project or something I'm watching, but I'm not actively pushing forward or leading myself. And then the third thing is what's something that I'm thinking about, but am likely not going to say yes to or take on this week. And I think that clarity has given me a chance to sort through what just practically what's mine to do in that week. Because I think initially I was like, well, whatever this week holds, because things were unraveling so quickly and I would be getting asks across the board. And it was really hard to discern, like, is this really important? And how much am I expected to kind of take on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a very beautiful way of approaching it. That kind of the importance of the gospel of rest, and really internalizing that idea that God wants you to rest, and that it's also part of serving Him is to rest as well. It's not to kind of rush around and try and take on, be responsive to every project that gets thrown at you. But in order to give of yourself, you have to reserve some of that energy so that you can give more wisely and more consciously, I guess, to the things that God has gifted you with. I've got a couple of bonus questions from the audience. So I'm going to throw those in there and see how it goes on that. And actually, I'm going to take the first question that comes in from the audience and actually flip it. I'm going to take the liberty of flipping it into a 2-part question. The original question is, what do you wish older, more seasoned leaders were more aware of? And what advice do you have for them? And I'm actually going to be a little bit cheeky and take that question, flip it the other way as well, and say, can you answer a second part too about what do you wish younger people coming into the workplace were aware of? And what advice would you have for them as well?
Oh, that was so good. I was just listening to this podcast on differences in ministry spaces between Gen Z leaders and Gen Z folks coming into the workplace or ministry spaces, and those who have been in ministry spaces for longer, and noting that there is a very real tension between how things are done. And sometimes it's minor. I was leading prayer in a meeting with a global leadership team for an organization I work with, and they asked me to pray. And I prayed, and after I prayed, one of my senior colleagues told me, I've never heard the phrase, yeah, God, in a prayer before. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, I think this is Gen Z maybe of me to say. So some of them is, just a little bit of those challenges or cultural or language differences. And then other pieces, there's obviously more serious things to that. For younger, I think that there is a humility that's needed. What I've been saying more often is that I think, I'll say Gen Z specifically because I am Gen Z. I think we are looking for mentorship. And I think we are looking for older and wiser leaders to walk alongside us. And I think in the absence or in the miscommunication or misunderstanding of generations, there can sometimes be this walking away. Either older generations walking away and say, I don't understand why younger generations do this, or vice versa, younger generations saying, no one's giving me the support or understanding or wisdom I need, and so I'm going to look elsewhere. The reality is younger generations will look elsewhere. We're pretty savvy in that, unfortunately, and AI and social media is becoming a pretty large source of expertise. I say that very lightly because nothing quite can challenge or nothing matches up to lived experiences and the lived experiences and wisdom that's really there. So I think humility is really required. The other thing I think is that I think younger generations, we bring in a creativity and innovation and desire to see things done differently. And so we might do that in ways that are a little clunky or ways that are a little bit awkward or maybe even inappropriate to a a formal workplace environment sometimes. And so I think too that that is also why we need older generations to come alongside and gently guide, but then also give spaces for our ideas to come through. Because I think we've watched and observed a lot of the world already, and in a lot of ways have been engaged in conversations like these earlier on than maybe other generations were at our age.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Yeah, it's really interesting actually that you raised a point about Gen Zs coming into the workplace, and that the lesson that you would impart to them is about humility, because it's sort of the flip side of what the one of the traits that I really admire about Gen Zs, and that is that of self-advocacy. And you've talked a little bit about your own self-advocacy, being able to set boundaries, being able to work with people who are much older than you, being able to work cross-culturally. In order to do that, you have to set boundaries. And I know that in this stage of your career, you've sort of been exploring where those boundaries exactly are. Are you going to set firmer boundaries? Are you going to be more explorative and creative? So I think that the sort of tension between humility to accept lessons from possible career mentors and looking out for them, but also being able to self-advocate so that you're not kind of run over with project requests. Being able to maintain that tension is probably where the answer sits, but it's also really tricky, right? That's not a very definite. It's hard to give people advice like that, because it sort of sounds like you're suggesting that they do two contradictory things at once. And a lot of things in life are about maintaining tension between two possibly conflicting drives or initiatives. The second question, I feel like you've answered this question a lot, but I will still pose this question because it's come from one of our audience members. And they're asking, what's been effective for you in managing stress in work and life? And we talked a little bit about the gospel of rest, but are there other ways in which you have developed techniques to manage stress in both your professional life and your personal life?
Yeah, I think one of those things is, I think what I've said before is like taking things slower, which is counterintuitive to how I am, and then how I've seen or am familiar with managing crises or responding to them. And so I think slowing down. With my work, I work variable time zones and hours. And so, last week I had a midnight webinar I was on and leading. And then my work day following looked a little bit different. And so I think this works well with my personality, but I'm a little bit more flexible with my time and energy, knowing that certain time and energy came from other areas. Sometimes at that one midnight to 2 a.m. block rather than a 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. block. And then I think another piece is community and creativity. I think I have a really strong community around me that's able to remind me that there's so much more going on outside of the work that I do, and that there's a lot of beautiful ways that God is also working in the world. And so I think remembering that in a context where it's always hard and there's always crises and there's always more suffering, remembering the good that's out there has been really helpful. And then creativity for me personally has been a fantastic outlet. I'm an artist and spent a lot of time just painting or writing or drawing, and offering that back to the Lord as well, and just play and rest. I think they go together. And so there's been ways that, and I think I realized like I have to intentionally set those times aside, or else my work will bleed into every area, and it has. I think, I have a 2-hour block. I'm technically free. I don't mind working, more emails or more projects until then. So intentionally setting that as a priority has been hard, but a really good discipline to learn.
Yeah, you shared so many different lessons from all of your different experiences, and I'm really deeply appreciative of that. So for one final question, I would like to ask about, what sort of a final thing that you would like a final leadership lesson, I suppose, that you would like leaders like you to remember. And I know that we had talked a little bit about kingdom collaboration over competition. So could you share a little about your thoughts on that subject, just as a final thought here?
Yes, and I shared that with you prior when we were talking about prepping for this call, and I think it's something that really stuck out to me after I was in meetings with our organizational meetings back in October or November. But I came away just noting how important it was that we enter into spaces with a collaboration mindset over competition.
Mm.
And I think that was just from experiencing the grace and encouragement from older leaders who took time to sit down with me and listen and give advice and share their resources and networks and influence. And I think that especially in under-resourced settings, where we might always have money to go around, but we have networks and wisdom, encouragement. And I think that I just came away from those meetings really struck by that's an actual posture I want to live by. That kingdom collaboration over competition in every area of my life. That's when we're able to truly share resources, expand reach, and contribute towards creating more spacious and welcoming and generative communities of leaders. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's such an important concept, and I didn't want to sort of leave it out, that idea of kingdom collaboration over competition. If it's just one thing that our guests are going to take away from this conversation, I hope that they will really bear that in mind, because I think in many ways it's countercultural to the world and the community and the culture in which we live and work. And so I think because it's countercultural, it doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does mean we need to try a little bit harder to emphasize that in our work and to evangelize about it to those that we work with, or even those that we minister alongside. So, I'm glad that you have that as a somewhat unofficial motto, because I hope that in generations to come, that the work community will see that collaboration over competition is what's going to lift all of us as a community. And I think that has actually been a hard struggle to kind of wedge into the workplace, especially the workplace as it's become, in the current environment. As you say, there's always some element of under-resource. Either we don't have enough money, or we don't have enough time, or under-resourced in other ways, or we don't have enough energy, or maybe not enough willpower. And so to be able to overcome that and to bring any given team or any given work culture into a space of spaciousness, as it were, a space of collaboration, a place of abundance, an idea that we're not under-resourced because God has given us everything that we need in order to achieve our goals, is often challenging. And so I think that being able to evangelize about a collaborative approach is going to end up being very powerful. So thank you for sharing all of those leadership lessons. I have really learned a lot from your wisdom and your gentleness, and obviously the work that you do is very fascinating, particularly for me because I work in an adjacent field. And so we're very grateful that you've been able to share all of those stories and lessons to our listening audience. Before I let you go, I'd really love to ask how our audience members might be able to keep up with your work. Are you available on socials? And perhaps you could share a little about which socials you're on and how we can keep track of you and pray for you.
Thank you. Yeah, I not really on social media, but I do blog, and I have a lot of resources on there just explaining about this work that I do, and really hope is making secular policy language more accessible to understand in Christian spaces. So what are refugees? How do refugee policies impact everyday people? I talk a lot about ongoing current issues, and how we as Christians, it's really part of our mandate from the Bible, a biblical mandate to engage. And so you can find it there on migrationandfaith.com. And then on there as well, you can also look and see, if you feel led, I am fundraising right now to cover the end of my fellowship. And so yeah, we're still fundraising right now. So all my details are on migrationandfaith.com. But really grateful. Thanks, Rowena, for letting me come on, and the Khora team for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for those that are listening, if you feel so led, please pray for Johanna's work and her ministry. And also, if you can go to Migration and Faith and support her, then that would be awesome as well. Um, we thank Johanna, who is a refugee advocacy research fellow with the World Evangelical Alliance, for sharing so many poignant and wise lessons from her time in leadership and in working with refugees around the world. Next up, next month, we are going to be featuring Steve Hong of Kingdom Rice. He's the executive director at Kingdom Rice. He's based here on the West Coast, as Johanna and I also are, and he's going to be talking about urban ministry in an Asian American Christian context. Thank you for tuning in today. This is Rowena Chu with Khora Collective.